The next day was a Monday, which meant that Penelope took tea with the Bridgerton ladies at number 5. She didn't know when precisely she would fall into that habit, but it had been so far close to a decade, and if she didn't show up on a Monday afternoon, she rather thought Lady Bridgerton would send someone over to fetch her. Penelope rather enjoyed the Bridgerton custom of tea and biscuits in the afternoon. It wasn't a widespread ritual. Indeed, Penelope knew of no one else who made a daily habit of it. But Lady Bridgerton insisted that she simply could not last from luncheon to supper, especially not when they were observing town hours and eating so late at night. And thus, every afternoon at 4, she and any number of her children, and often a friend or two, met in the informal upstairs drawing room for a sneak. There was drizzle in the air, even though it was a fairly warm day, so Penelope took her black parasol with her for the short walk over to number 5. It was a route she had followed hundreds of times before, a few houses down to the corner of Mount and Davy Street, then along the edge of Berkeley Square to Bruton Street. But she was in an odd mood that day, a little bit light-hearted and maybe even a little bit childish. So she decided to cut across the northern corner of the Berkeley Square green for no other reason than she liked the squishy sound her boots made on the wet grass. It was Lady Danbury's fault. It had to be. She had been positively giddy since their encounter the night before. Not what I thought I was, she sang to herself as she walked, adding a word every time the soles of her boots sank into the ground. Something more, something more. She reached a particularly wet patch and moved like a skater on the grass, singing so much from the night before that she actually wanted someone to hear her singing in public. Something more as she slid forward, which was, of course, since it was fairly well established in her own mind at least that she had the worst timing in the history of civilization. Right when she heard a male voice call out her name, she skidded to a halt and gave fervent thanks that she caught her balance at the very last moment instead of landing on her bottom on the wet and messy grass. It was, of course, him. Colin, she said in a slightly embarrassed voice, holding still as she waited for him to reach her side. What a surprise! He looked like he was trying to smile. Were you dancing? Dancing? She echoed. It looked like you were dancing. Oh no, she swallowed guiltily, because even though she wasn't technically lying, it felt as if she were. Of course not. His eyes crinkled slightly at the commas. Pity then. I would have felt compelled to partner you, and I've never danced in Berkeley Square. If he would said the same to her just 2 days earlier, she would have laughed at his joke and let him be the witty and charming one. But she must have heard Lady Danbury's voice at the back of her head again, because she suddenly decided she didn't want to be the same old Penelope Featherington. She decided to join in the fun. She smiled a smile she didn't think she would even know how to smile. It was wicked and she was mysterious. And she knew it wasn't all in her head because Colin's eyes widened markedly as she murmured, That's a shame. It's rather enjoyable. Penelope Featherington, he told, I thought you said you were in dancing. She shrugged. I lied. If that's the case, he said, then surely this must be my dance. Penelope's inside suddenly felt very queer. This was why she shouldn't let whispers from Lady Danbury go to her head. She might manage daring and charm for a fleeting moment, but she had no idea how to follow the rope. Unlike Colin, obviously, who was grinning devilishly as he held his arms out in perfect voice position. Colin, she gasped, we're in Berkeley Square. I know. I just finished telling you I've never danced here, don't you recall? But, Colin closed his arms. Tisk, tisk, you can't issue a dare like that and then try to whistle out of it. Besides, dancing in Berkeley Square seems like the sort of a thing a person ought to do at least once in his life. Wouldn't you agree? Anyone might see, she whispered urgently. He shrugged. trying to hide the fact that he was rather entertained by her reaction. I don't care, do you? Her cheeks grew pink and then red, and it seemed to take her a great deal of effort to form the words. People will think you are courting me. He watched her closely, not understanding why she was disturbed. Who cared if people thought they were courting? The rumor would soon be proven false, and they would have a good laugh at society's expense. It was on the tip of his tongue to say, "Hang society," but he held silent. There was something lurking deep in the brown depths of her eyes, some emotion he couldn't even begin to identify. An emotion he suspected he would never even felt. And he realized that the last thing he wanted to do was hurt Penelope Featherington. She was his sister's best friend, and moreover, she was plain and simple, a very nice girl. Wow. He frowned. He supposed he shouldn't be calling her a girl anymore. At 8 and 20, she was no more a girl than he was still a boy at 3 and 30. Finally, with great care and what he hoped was a good dose of sensitivity, he asked, "Is there a reason why we should worry if people think we are courting?" She closed her eyes, and for a moment Colin actually thought she might be in pain. When she opened them, her gaze was almost bittersweet. "It would be very funny actually," she said. At first, he said nothing, just waited for her to continue. But eventually it would become apparent that we are not actually courting, and it would... She stopped, swallowed, and Colin realized that she was not as composed on the inside as she hoped to appear. It would be assumed, she continued, that you were the one to break things off because, well, it just would be. He didn't argue with her. He knew that her words were true. She let out a sad-sounding exhale. I don't want to subject myself to that. Even Lady Whistledown would probably write about it. How could she not? It would be far too juicy a piece of gossip for her to resist. I'm sorry, Penelope, Colin said. He wasn't sure what he was apologizing for, but it still seemed like the right thing to say. She acknowledged him with a tiny note. I know I shouldn't care what other people say, but I do. He found himself turning slightly away as he considered her words. Or maybe he was considering the tone of her voice, or maybe both. He would always thought of himself as somewhat above society, not really outside of it. Precisely, since he certainly moved within it and usually enjoyed himself quite a bit. But he would always assume that his happiness did not depend upon the opinions of others. Maybe he wasn't thinking about this right way. It was easy to assume that you didn't care about the opinions of others when those opinions were consistently favorable. Would he be so quick to dismiss the rest of the society if they treated him the way they treated Penelope? She would never been ostracized, never been made the subject of scandal. She just hadn't been popular. Oh, people were polite, and the Bridgertons had all befriended her. But most of Colin's memories of Penelope involved her standing at the perimeter of a ballroom, trying to look anywhere but at the dancing couples, clearly pretending that she really didn't want to dance. That was usually when he went over and asked for himself. She always looked grateful for the request, but also a bit embarrassed, because they both knew he was doing it at least a little bit because he felt sorry for her. Colin tried to put himself in her shoes. It wasn't easy. He would always been popular. His friends had looked up to him at school, and the women had flocked to his side when he had entered society. And as much as he could say, he didn't care what people thought when it came right down to it. He rather liked being liked. Suddenly, he didn't know what to say, which was strange because he always knew what to say. In fact, he was somewhat famous for always knowing what to say. He reflected probably one of the reasons he was so well liked. But he sensed that Penelope's feelings depended on his next words, and at some points in the last 10 minutes, her feelings had become very important to him. "You're right," he finally said, deciding that it was always a good idea to tell someone she was correct. "It was very insensitive of me. Perhaps we should start anew." She blinked. "I beg your pardon." He waved his hand about as if the motion could explain everything. "Make a fresh start." She looked quite adorably confused, which confused him since he would never thought Penelope the least bit adorable. "But we have known each other for 12 years, she said. "Has it really been that long?" He searched his brain, but for the life of him, he couldn't recall the event of their first meeting. Never mind that. I meant just for this afternoon, you ninny. She smiled, clearly in spite of herself, and he knew that calling her a ninny had been the exact right thing to do, although in all truth he had no idea why. Here we go, he said slowly, drawing his words out with a long flourish of his arm. You are walking across Berkeley Square and you spy me in the distance. I call out your name and you reply by saying, Penelope caught her lower lip between her teeth, trying for some unknown reason to contain her smile. What magical star had Colin been born into, that he always knew what to say? He was the Pied Piper, leaving nothing but happy hearts and smiling faces in his wake. Penelope would have bet money, far more than the £1,000 Lady Danbury had offered her, that she was not the only woman in London desperately in love with the third Bridgerton. He dipped his head to the side and then writhed it in a prompting sort of motion. I would reply, Penelope said slowly. I would reply, Colin waited 2 seconds and said, Really? Any words will do. Penelope had planned to fix a bright grin on her face, but she discovered that the smile on her lip was quite genuine. Colin, she said, trying to sound as if she would just been surprised by his arrival. What are you doing about? Excellent reply, he said. She shook her finger at him. You're breaking out of character. Yes, of course. Apologies. He paused, blinked twice, then said, Here we are. How about this? Much the same as you, I imagine. Heading to number 5 for tea? Penelope found herself falling into the rhythm of the conversation. You sound as if you're just going for a visit. Don't you live there? He grimaced. Hopefully just for the next week. A fortnight at most. I'm trying to find a new place to live. I had to give up the lease on my old set of rooms when I left for Cyprus, and I haven't found a suitable replacement yet. I had a bit of business down on Piccadilly and thought I would walk back. In the rain? He shrugged. It wasn't raining when I left earlier this morning, and even now it's just a drizzle. Just drizzle, Penelope thought. Drizzle that clung to his obscenely long eyelashes, framing eyes of such perfect green that more than one young lady had been moved to write poetry about them. Even Penelope, level-headed as she liked to think herself, had spent many a night in bed, staring at the ceiling and seeing nothing but those eyes. Just drizzle indeed. Penelope, she snapped to attention. Right, yes, I'm going to your mother's for tea as well. I do so every Monday and often on other days too, she admitted. And there is nothing interesting at my house? No need to sound so guilty about it. My mother's a lovely woman. If she wants you over for tea, you should go. Penelope had a bad habit of trying to hear between the lines of people's conversations, and she had a suspicion that Colin was really saying that he didn't blame her if she wanted to escape her own mother from time to time, while somehow, unaccountably, made her feel a little sad. He rocked on his heels for a moment and said, Well, I shouldn't keep you here in the rain. She smiled, since they had been standing outside for at least 15 minutes. Still, if he wanted to continue with the ruse, she would do so as well. I'm the one with the parasol, she pointed out. His lips curved slightly. So you are, but still, I wouldn't be much of a gentleman if I didn't steer you toward a more hospitable environment. Speaking of which, he frowned, looking around. Speaking of what? Of being a gentleman. I believe we are supposed to see to the welfare of ladies. And? Shouldn't you have a maid with you? I live just around the corner, she said, a little bit deflated that he didn't remember that she and her sister were best friends with two of his sisters. After all, he would even walk her home once or twice. On Mount Street, she added when his frown did not dissipate. He squinted slightly, looking in the direction of Mount Street, although she had no idea what he hoped to accomplish by doing so. Oh, for heaven's sake, Colin, it's just near the corner of Davy Street. It can be more than a 5-minute walk to your mother's. For if I'm feeling exceptionally sprightly. I was just looking to see if there were any darkened or recessed spots. He turned back to face her, where a criminal might lurk. In Mayfair, he said grimly, I really think you ought to have a maid accompany you when you journey to and fro. I should hate for something to happen to you. She was sorely touched by his concern, even though she knew she would have extended equal thoughtfulness just about every female of his acquaintance. That was simply the sort of a man he was. I can assure you that I observe all of the usual properties when I am traveling longer distances, she said. But truly, this is so close, just a few blocks, really, even my mother doesn't mind. Colin's jaw suddenly looked quite stiff. Not to mention, Penelope added, that I am 8 and 20. What has that to do with anything? I'm 3 and 30, if you care to know. She knew that, of course, since she knew almost everything about him. Colin, she said, a slightly annoyed whine creeping into her voice. Penelope, he replied in exactly the same tone. She let out a long exhale before saying, I'm quite firmly on the shelf, Colin. I needn't worry about all of the rules that plagued me when I was 17. I hardly think one of Penelope's hands planted itself on her hip. Ask your sister if you don't believe me. He suddenly looked more serious than she had ever seen him. I make it a point not to ask my sister on matters that relate to common sense. Colin, Penelope exclaimed, that's a terrible thing to say. I didn't say I don't love her. I didn't even say I don't like her. I adore Eloise, as you well know. However, anything that begins with however has got to be bad, Penelope muttered. Eloise, he said with uncharacteristic high-handedness, should be married by now. Now that was really too much, especially in that tone of voice. Some might say, Penelope returned with a self-righteous little tilt of her chin, that you should be married by now too. Oh, you are, as you so proudly informed me, 3 and 30. His expression was slightly amused, but with a pale tinge of irritation which told her he would not remain amused for long. Penelope, don't even ancient, she chirped. He swore under his breath. It surprised her, since she didn't think she would ever heard him do so in the presence of a lady. She probably should have taken it as a warning, but she was too riled up. She supposed the old saying was true. Courage spawned more courage. Or maybe it was more that recklessness emboldened more recklessness, because she just looked at him harshly and said, weren't both of your older brothers married by the age of 30? To her surprise, Colin merely smiled and crossed his arms as he leaned one shoulder against the tree they were standing beneath. My brothers and I are very different men. It was Penelope realized a very telling statement, because so many members of the ton, including the fabled Lady Whistledown, made so much of the fact that the Bridgerton brothers looked so alike. Some had even gone so far as to call them interchangeable. Penelope hadn't thought any of them were bothered by this. In fact, she would assume they would all felt flattered by the comparison, since they seemed to like each other so well, but maybe she was wrong. Or maybe she would never look closely enough, which was rather strange, because she felt as if she would spend half her life watching Colin Bridgerton. One thing she did know, however, and should have remembered, was that if Colin had any sort of a temper, he had never chosen to let her see it. Surely she would flattered herself when she thought that her little quip about his brother marrying before they turned 30 might set him off. No, his method of attack was a lazy smile, a well-timed joke if Colin ever lost his temper. Penelope shook her head slightly, unable even to fathom it. Colin would never lose his temper, at least not in front of her. He would have to be really true, no, profoundly upset to lose his temper. And that kind of fury could only be sparked by someone you really, truly, profoundly cared about. Colin liked her well enough. Maybe even better than he liked most people, but he didn't care not that way. Perhaps we should just agree to disagree, she finally said. On what? Uh, she couldn't remember. On what a spinster may or may not do? He seemed amused by her hesitation. That would probably require that I defer to my younger sister's judgment in some capacity, which would be, as I'm sure you can imagine, very difficult for me. But you don't mind deferring to my judgment. Her smile was lazy and wicked. Not if you promise not to tell another living soul. He didn't mean it, of course, and she knew. She knew he didn't mean it, but that was his way. Humor and a smile could smooth any path. And blast him, it worked because she heard herself of sighing and felt herself smiling, and before she knew it, she was saying, "Enough. Let us be on our way to your mother's." Colin grinned. "Do you think she will have biscuits?" Penelope rolled her eyes. "I know she will have biscuits." "Good," he said, taking off at a lope and half dragging her with him. "I do love my family, but I really just go for the food."